The government was not ready, therefore providers could not be ready.
If you had to pick a few indicators of the success of support at home, what would they be?
There is pride, right? We all have pride and we don't actually want to admit where we perhaps might need some support. How does an assessor appropriately do that?
Well, I know you cannot refer the government to the ACCC.
Yeah.
Look, what was in...
They probably find themselves perform admirably anyway.
Maybe they would, but that might actually be, that might be a bit difficult.
Welcome to Time Well Spent, the podcast for decision makers, providers, and everyone working to make a difference in care. I'm Dane Mitchell, joined by my co-host, Rose Plater.
Together, we bring 31 years of combined experience and still counting, and a shared passion for reimagining aged care and community health. From policy and reform to leadership, culture and connection, this is where we explore new ideas, hear what leaders really think, and uncover what it takes to create environments where time is truly well spent.
The government says support is there when you need it, but the numbers suggest otherwise. 121,000 people are waiting for a home care package and have already been assessed, and another 116,000 people are waiting just to be assessed, with an estimate of 2,500 older Australians waiting in limbo in our hospitals every day. The real question is, does support at home actually solve the problem it was designed to fix? Will it deliver faster access, simpler funding, and a model that providers can confidently build around to meet the growing demand? Or are we just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while the waitlist grows longer and providers drown in regulatory change fatigue? Today, we're joined by Adrian Morgan, General Manager of Flexi Care, to unpack what's really happening on the ground and what needs to change before support at home goes live. Adrian, welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
It's great to have you.
Thank you.
Before we get into the weeds, can you give us a quick overview of what support at home is and what changes compared to the current system?
It's a very different system. There's almost every element of it has been affected in some way, particularly if we're comparing it to home care packages, because there's home care packages and there's the Commonwealth Home Support Program, of course, and that second program's not being touched at the moment. The differences are that particularly many older people have to make a much higher contribution towards the cost of their services from their own pocket. And that's where a lot of people will notice that those who are not grandfathered or so-called grandfathered, the grandfathered people are the ones who are in the home care package system in September last year, 12th of September last year. So increasing numbers of people after the 1st of November will have to pay from their own pocket. And some of those people will be having to pay up to 80% of the full cost of the service, depending on what it is. That's a very significant change from one where the overwhelming number of people were not paying much, if anything.
Is that determined by means testing or?
It's a combination. So it's both means testing in terms of the person, their pension status, basically. So are you a full pensioner, part pensioner, or self-funded retiree? And depending on which of those categories you're in will depend on a percentage that you pay. But the other thing that determines the amount you've got to pay for something is the type of service it is. So the government has said that the tightly clinically related things, there's no charge. So nursing, allied health, podiatry, physio, hydro, OT, you won't make a contribution from your own pocket.
And that's across the board?
Across the board, whether you're grandfathered or not. And that's long term. The other two categories are things that are treated as what they're calling independent services. They're things like assistance with showering, dressing, hygiene, toileting, things like that. Also, social support's in that category. And people can make a contribution up to 50% of the cost if you're not grandfathered. And the final category is everyday living costs, which are things like help around the home. Accompanied and unaccompanied shopping is in that category as well. And it's that latter category, and that's up to 80% for people who are self-funded retirees. That's a very significant amount to find.
It'll be very expensive.
It will be very expensive for some people.
And confusing, because a lot of those categories of services are also covered by your CHSP funding or Commonwealth Home Support funding,
That's right.
which has no means tested fee at this stage, and they're not touching. So we've got consumers or clients in the community who are still kind of going to navigate a very confusing journey in terms of when I pay for supports or not.
Precisely. Well, they're already confused in a lot of cases. People on the whole don't know what program they're funded by. It's more often than not, they just don't know the name of the program. So a lot of people have been very confused by all of this, because if I go back to the grandparenting issue, the people who are grandparented, they're the ones who will end up paying will basically no more than they currently do. Those people were the ones that were in the system on the 12th of September last year. But the system has to be the home care package system, have been assessed as eligible or receiving, which leaves out the 850,000 people who are the Commonwealth Home Support Program people, which is the majority, unless they'd already been assessed for a home care package. And a very large number of people don't know this, and when they find out, they're often quite cross, understandably, because they thought they were covered, but they are caught up in the non-grandparenting side of the equation.
And so we've already seen the pushback of this reform now to the 1st of November.
Yes.
The system wasn't ready, whether that was provider side or government side is up for debate.
It's not for debate. The government wasn't ready. They hadn't issued their guidelines, their IT wasn't finished, and none of the regulations had been passed. The government was not ready, therefore providers could not be ready by definition.
Yes. And do you think we're in a better position today?
Yes.
About a week away from the 1st of November?
We are in a much better position than we were 4 months ago.
Are we where we should be?
No, because there are things that have been coming out as recently as a week ago, which are quite fundamental to the way the system will work. For example, how you'll be purchasing third-party items like
walkers.
Yes, I'd call them aids and appliances, or I think what's the current terminology? Assistive technology. Right.
An example relevant to my business is physio and OT. Last week we got an update that now you can bill non-billable time when you're doing physio and OT, and you're doing a lot of report writing, right? So we had to rewrite all our price guides, resend all our price guides, which is a sensible change.
Very good.
But it's so sensible and so obvious. Why couldn't we get that right in the first place?
Well, people have been arguing for that for months and months and months. And it came out, 24 days before the new program was going to begin. At the beginning, you asked me what's changing, and we ended up talking a lot about the contributions that people will need to make. But there are a lot of other things changing as well. One of them will be in the rigidity of the system. So in the past, and again, we're comparing to home care packages now, if people were approved for a home care package, essentially you could take the funding you received and then negotiate with your provider about the services that you would receive, which would be the best mix of things to help you support yourself at the time, whatever that mix was. And in many older people's lives, they tend to be quite volatile, things that they didn't need last week, they do need this week. So it had a flexibility built into it. You could respond incredibly quickly to changes that were going on. Essentially, much of that will be lost with support at home, because once we get past the 1st of November and new people are entering the system for the first time, they'll have to have been assessed as eligible for a particular service to get that service.
On the
initial assessment, or if you haven't, say you need nursing and you didn't need it before, but you need it now. So maybe you start off the support you're getting in support at home. Maybe you're getting some personal care, help with showering and things like that. You might be getting a bit of domestic assistance, but you potentially even just bump your leg and have a skin tear. It would be very helpful if you could get some nursing help to help that wound heal quickly. Under the old system, home care package, you negotiate that with your home care package provider, and tomorrow, literally tomorrow, you can have the service you need by swinging some of the support you previously had for, let's say, some of the domestic help, we will get the leg fix. What will have to happen in the future will have to be reassessed.
And we always know that government assessments are always timely, and we never have any downtime, do we?
Except for the 121,000 people who are currently waiting nationally. And that often rolls out to be months and months and months. And one of the flow-on impacts of this once we get into the new program, so that will mean there'll be a rigidity there that wasn't in the past, but there'll also be a workload associated with assessment that wasn't there before. You didn't have to be reassessed before. So we've already got 121,000 people waiting. I think that was the last publicly released figures. It'll just add to that list, because the people who didn't need to be helped, using the example I gave then with the nurse, those people will need to be reassessed. So they'll add to the queue of people waiting to be assessed. My theory is that the system will either collapse under the weight of the reassessments, because they're finding it also, some organisations are finding it difficult to get enough assessors, or they'll have to change the rules. I don't know how quickly that would happen, but I hope that the department would be watching for the impact of these rigidities.
So in reality, we'll have 120,000 consumers that should be entering the system on the 1st of November. Might not get that quickly. They will have been assessed a year or 18 months ago around the needs. So they'll get given the services types that they needed 18 months ago. And then we're going to have a glut of these reassessments, because who knows where they are today.
Yeah, and that's already a problem with home care packages, is that people may have been waiting 6, 12 months, and the first thing you find is that, well, what was assessed is actually not what the person needs now. And there is a requirement, if they need more, that you put them back in the list for reassessment. But the benefit at the moment is if they need something different, but within the current funding envelope, you can just do it.
You can prioritise, say, that nursing wound. I'm going to give up my weekly shopping. I can do some online shopping. My daughter can help me out with that. I'm going to spend my money today on nursing, where on the 1st of November, if I'm a new client, that might be weeks down the road. So I'm now going to put weight on the months.
So how long will it be?
Yeah.
So look, I would hope also they identify a fast path through for people in that kind of situation, where they don't do a comprehensive assessment, but they do a quick review. Is that going to work in practice? I think it'd be very unlikely that you'd be able to replicate what we've got today, which is basically immediate response.
I mean, the government has been saying that support at home will make the system more responsive and meet the demand faster. But from what you're saying, sounds like you disagree with that.
Completely. I think that's what they'd like it to be. And I think there's a degree to which they genuinely think it could be true. I can't see how it is. I can't see in the system design that they've built that into its DNA. I mean, they've added some good things to the program. For example, embedding the restorative care pathway, creating a pathway for people to get aids, equipment and home modifications without having to save up for it. That makes good sense. And the other one is the end-of-life pathway. That's a good idea. On that last one, and it's a substantial amount of funding over potentially a 3-month period, possibly can be extended to 4 months. This is one of those really good ideas where I'm worried that in practice it's actually going to create a new problem.
We're talking about the palliative care pathway.
Yes, I think they're calling it an end-of-life pathway, but yes. So you need the entry to that, there's some assessment requirement, but essentially it's around being expected to have 3 months or less to live. But the science around that is not perfect. And I think that the problem will come because you're allowed to extend the funding across 4 months. What happens in the 15th week of the 4 months? If the person is alive, which is great.
But likely
And
higher needs.
higher needs and about to lose them.
Yeah.
At a point of probably maximum stress for that individual in their life, at a point where the organisations that are supporting that person are probably sort of doing everything they can to make sure that they are well supported, the funding for that support will be withdrawn. Now, there are some words there in the guidelines around, well, have a look at it, but how quickly will that happen? And it's just simply anxiety producing. I think that's another example where you could rethink the way that would work and achieve what they're striving to achieve more successfully.
Do you have an alternate way to achieve that?
I wouldn't say I can give it to you in precise words, but essentially it would be about an automatic extension under certain circumstances, so that they're not guessing whether they'll get it. They will know.
Yeah, if you want to go through that stage at home, you can, and you're supported through it.
Be supported through the whole stage. Yeah.
But I guess in the reality of the failing of this will mean that people will have to pass away in hospitals, right? If they have been on a palliative care pathway, they've been supported by this wonderful home support package that has, then we're going to pull the rug from underneath them. No longer we can supply you a nurse. So they're going to end up in the public hospital system if they can't afford it themselves. So it's kind of contradictory. I think you use the words cruel in terms of...
Yeah, it is. I think it is, particularly for the family members and the person involved. They should not be facing a stress like that after having been supported so well. Going back to my general point, which is it's basically a really good idea. Let's see it through. On the other hand, I see that the government doesn't want to create a blank check, but they could put criteria in place which are shared and publicly known. I think it's a detail about the design.
Is that designing a system around probably those that they feel aren't going to comply in terms of driving profit in this sector, rather than looking at the majority of providers really providing genuine care and services in this space? Like, we're creating this to have a cap so that we can stop those who would be putting in unfair palliative care claims. But really,
I won't assess their motives.
Yeah,
we could speculate.
Very, very well said.
You've been very vocal about the quarterly budgeting model and the need for carryover.
Yes.
Why is that such a critical issue? And what's the practical alternative that would still keep the system accountable?
The current arrangement proposed is that you'll be able to carry forward 10% of your funding from a quarter, that's quarter by quarter, or $1,000, whichever is the greater figure. And that's a good idea to an extent, but I think they could have gone further. And I would be suggesting they look at a figure more like 25%. And the reason is the more you can build in a bit of flexibility in the system to enable services to expand or contract based on needs that are emerging without having to go back through reassessment. So it's about avoiding unnecessary reassessment, because if you think about that, even if you can carry forward more between a quarter and the next quarter, though you can't keep adding to that over time, you can only ever take the most recent quarter and carry over. It's not cumulative. So it wouldn't be blowing the budget for the government at all to increase it to 25%. It would have a small marginal increase early on, but then once the system's running, would probably be no practical difference. And you'd be saving money in unnecessary reassessment to get to higher funding levels.
And you're giving a consumer greater choice.
You are, well, yes, you're opening up the choice again in ways that's been partially closed down.
So there's some benefit there in that we're going to see the reduction of, there's a lot of unspent funds sitting around the system, that we're going to see the kind of incentives there to actually use the services that you're assessed to use, but it's possibly going to create this bigger burden where we all know everyone's aging journey will fluctuate depending on different things that happen throughout their lives. There might be some reassessment unintended consequences, I guess, in reassessment that we'll just have to be chasing our tail in order to
and
get the
reassessment
funds.
is cost and delay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And further
unnecessary.
probably to deterioration and stress on the person.
I think one of the issues with supported home is it's been designed. It really has been designed, I think, for a population with stable needs, and that's not our older population.
Wouldn't it be nice if we were all that predictable?
Wouldn't it be nice if we're all that predictable? And it's people's health conditions can change very dramatically, but so can their personal circumstances. People's informal carers can be sick, pass away or go into hospital, and suddenly all that help that they had yesterday disappears tomorrow. But also there's all the health conditions which are often for older people quite variable from week to week, month to month, in unpredictable ways. These are not predictable, easily planned pathways, which is why I think if I was redesigning it, one of the things I'd put in its DNA would be flexibility. Lots of flexibility, but then on the assumption that over time things would balance out and you can make a fair estimate for what's needed over time.
Now, the proposed co-contribution model has raised eyebrows. We've touched on it a little bit already.
Yes.
So especially that idea around the changing in contribution dependent on your service requirements. What risks do you see there are for equity and access, and how could they unintentionally push people out of the system?
Yes, well, I think some people will almost inevitably reject services that they would benefit from receiving. And I'd be thinking particularly about things like personal care, which tends to be, when you need personal care, you tend to really need it, particularly if it's things like showering and support with showering. And it's one of the things that keeps people out of residential care unnecessarily and out of hospital. Whereas if people are not getting the showers and personal care that they need, they will tend to end up being more susceptible to infection, also all the issues to do with dignity that go with that. But the costs could be quite high. So if you're paying up to 50% of that, and say, for example, you're in the self-funded retiree category, but you're only just a self-funded retiree, you're not really, and you're not getting a Commonwealth health card, you probably don't have a lot of disposable income available to you. So it's just in those thresholds that as you move there to that category, the chances are you're not going to be able to afford potentially $250, $300 a week in a co-contribution to be supported. And the other thing with a personal care is when people don't get it, they also can end up in hospital because sometimes they'll try and have a shower unsupported when they shouldn't. They'll fall, be injured. Where does that put them? That puts them in hospital. If these were rare occurrences, I wouldn't be focusing on them as I am, but I think that they're not. I think they're actually quite typical things that can happen for older people. We can design a much better system that is much more effective in actually making sure people get what they need. So that's one example I gave. Let's give another example of supported shopping. So that's in the everyday living, so it's up to 80%. The minimum you'll be paying is 17.5%, and depending on how many hours you would need, you could be paying quite a lot of money per week, per month, even as a full pensioner. But for many people, what we might think of as supported shopping is actually a social outing. It's actually getting out of the house. For some people, it's the only time they go out, but it gives them a reason to go out. And when they're out, they're mixing with people, they're seeing people, it's good for them, they're moving. For some people, it's an exercise opportunity. It's an informal exercise opportunity. I think that category will be one where a lot of people will say, I'll just order food online. Because most people who get the accompanied shopping aren't getting it because they need just food. They're actually doing it because there's another benefit in it for them, and quite a considerable benefit in terms of that social contact.
It's quite it feels like a false dichotomy in terms of we're discouraging or there's a lack of incentive to actually take up those supports, which are actually going to enable you to stay at home longer. You know, the it is such a huge thing for most people to say and put their hand up to say, yes, I need personal care. I do need someone to come and help me shower. That's something that people really don't want to. And now we're going to say, you're also paying how much of that yourself?
Yeah, that's right. And it depends how often you get it, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to create this burden of people delaying that because they've saved their money. They don't want to do this. They've still got this contribution to make. And then we're going to need the nursing support earlier, perhaps.
Perhaps, yes. Yeah, and look, it'll have all sorts of impacts and consequences. Many people will react to, once they realise, particularly if they're in that CHSP group, that didn't think they're going to be hit by a co-contribution. They find they are. I think quite a lot of them will balk at these services.
Well, I think that also what I see from the provider side is that the consumer is confused. So why, provider? Last week you weren't charging me for this CHSP personal care that I was getting. Now I've got more government support and you're charging me more? That doesn't make sense.
I think for older people, the whole thing is incredibly complex. And given all these different categories of things and different percentages, it's intrinsically very complex. So we're starting with people being confused before anything happens. We add all this confusion in. And if you look, the government communication around this has not been very clear, or from the department. A lot has been left to others to do.
But given that we're a week or so out from implementation, we're unlikely to get a full system reboot like you're suggesting we might need. So is there some simple practical changes we can make or we can advocate for when this podcast goes viral?
Yes, exactly. Precisely.
That will actually make a practical difference in the short term.
Well, I think one of the things that could happen would be, and this would cost the government a little bit of money in the short term, and I think save them in the medium and long term, would be to recategorise the personal care and to treat that as a clinical service and say you don't make a personal contribution to that. I would allow a bigger carryover in funding, and as I've already said, I don't think it in the medium and long term it would cost the government any more for that to allow, say, for example, a 25% carryover. I think they could consider reclassifying shopping as treat it the same way as a
clinical service.
Well, not necessarily clinical. If they want to retain a tier, you could put it in the category of the social support, which is that mid support. I think if the government was actually prepared to put its hands a little bit more deeply in its pocket, though, I think one of the things they could do is reduce the percentage contribution maximum figure. Currently 50% or 80%, maybe pull it back to 30% or 25% and 50% maximum. And that way you could actually assess what's the impact of having to make a very substantial contribution on people's preparedness to get services that they actually need.
And are there any lifetime caps on any of these contributions?
There is a lifetime cap. It's a big number and it'll take you a very long time to get there through support at home.
Yeah.
I think what would be more helpful would be a weekly cap or a fortnightly cap, or maybe even a quarterly cap. I think that would be far more helpful, but I think it would also undermine the government's plan to save a lot of money. Because if we remember when this was being discussed by the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, he certainly made reference to the considerable amounts of money that the new Aged Care Act would be saving. Was it 18.8 billion over, was it the forward estimates? It's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And part of that was the support at home changes.
Yeah.
Changing pace a little bit to focus on the impact on providers. You've argued that care management funding needs to increase to around 15% of budgets. Why is that piece so important? And maybe if you can give us a bit of where we've come from to where we're going to,
yes.
and what happens if it's not resourced properly?
So care management is a critical function, and it's where older people are supported to support them to make the decisions that they need to make to help them get the most out of the system. I can draw on my own organisation's experience at the moment to bring it to life. We're allowed to charge currently up to 20%. They'll be reducing it to 10%. Our organisation's spending a bit over 16% and we charge people 15%. So we think that's a fairer kind of contribution in terms of the amount of work that there is. It's really based on the fact that a lot of older people do need a fair amount of support to help them make good decisions about the expenditure of their money.
And navigating the system, what you can get, what you can't get, all the confusion we've talked about.
Confusion, but also the volatility. So the department tends to say, well, it's the money goes into a pool and sometimes people need more and they'll need less. But I think, again, going back to my organisation's example, we are not over servicing or over supporting, but it's costing 16% currently. We wouldn't want to be in a position where we had to reduce that amount of support for people because that comes at a cost. It means for example, somebody wants to ring in and be able to talk to their care manager or their home care partner, as we call the role. They should be able to do so. If you end up having to save large amounts of money, the pressure will potentially be there to find ways of not doing that. And that's exactly what older people need. They'll often need the help in the moment, at that time.
And in person.
And not 3 days' time or in a week's time or 2 weeks' time.
So effectively, what you're saying is that burden of figuring it out and figuring out a complex system will fall to the individual and there may not be as much support there as they need.
And or their family. And for people who've got good support from their family and family have time to do it and the skill and the wherewithal, well, they'll probably be okay. But a lot of people don't. A lot of people don't have access to family support or friends who are able to help them. People have very busy lives. There are people who are estranged from their families. There are people who haven't had families in the first place to call upon. There are people with cognitive decline issues. They tend to find the system more confusing. They need more help. People from a called background tend to. People who have sight or hearing impairment. All of these categories of people tend to need a bit more help than might be a person who is very cognitively intact, has a great family support network. Maybe they worked as a nurse. Maybe they're a doctor. They know a lot about the health system. They'll probably still need some help, but they won't need as much help as the average person for whom this is bewildering on the whole.
And in terms of, I guess, sustainability for providers, do you think this is going to be a real challenge for good providers to stay in the sector?
I think they'll be making decisions about what to do about it. There's several options as to how you respond. One, I guess, is you do pull back on the services and simply say we can't afford to employ the number of home care partners as we did previously. Or do you build some of the cost of providing that support into the hourly rate that people pay for their services? So that bumps up the hourly rate, making it a little bit harder for them to make their co-contributions if they have to. I think there's a moral dilemma that sits behind this. You know people need the support. You really, really should be providing it. I understand the department states that its data tells them it currently costs, on average, organisations about 10.5% of the income to provide this service.
But provide the management service?
Yeah, the home care package, the care management.
Yeah.
But the problem is that, being blunt about it, quite a large percentage of providers are not meeting the standards relating to the provision of planning and support for older people that the aged care quality standards already require of them. There's a very large percentage that falls short, and I can't remember the precise number, but we're not talking 1 or 2%, talking 20, 30%. And of course you can save money if you don't do the job properly. So that's part of the dragging the average down. Because in talking to organisations that I have about how much they're spending where I know them to be doing a good job, it tends to be 15, 16, 17, 18%. So I think this will be problematic, and it's something the industry has lobbied very hard on to try to get the government to revisit this issue. They're not prepared to revisit it. They've really dug in very tight around this issue.
You publicly criticised, and I read a couple of newspaper articles, the government's Support at Home ad campaign, suggesting it should be referred to ACCC for misleading advertising. What was it about that message that you felt required referral to the ACCC?
Well, I know you cannot refer the government to the ACCC. It was much more about, I wish you could.
Yeah.
Look, what was in...
They'd probably find themselves perform admirably anyway.
Maybe they would, but that might actually be, that might be a bit difficult. So look, in advertising, you're required to be honest and not mislead. So the thing that I was actually referring to was very specific. It was a video that the department had prepared for it. Went for about 3 minutes about support at home, and it just included false statements, in my view. And one of them said, with support at home, you can get all the care you need when and where you need it. Now, that is demonstrably false, because we have 121,000 people waiting even to be assessed for their eligibility. And once you're assessed, you're then going to have another, 6, 7 months, 8, 9 months waiting to get it. That's not when and where it's required. If a company were to say that about its services, they could expect a knock on the door from the ACCC and a fine from the federal court. So I think at minimum, the department should be rigorous about being careful that it's not misleading older people about what they will get. Because the older person who sees that, who believes it, and...
You've then got to try and deliver on that expectation.
Well, which is you can't.
Yeah. It's not in your wheelhouse to be able to change that assessment, to be able to assess them for needing that nursing care today if they didn't have the assessment yesterday.
Yeah.
And I guess in terms of the Royal Commission, one of the things was the confusing things in the system and how it isn't a very good system to navigate. I think there was high hopes for this change from the home care to the care at home. What are some of the things that are promised versus the reality of what we have?
Well, what was hoped for was a system that would be easier for older people to navigate, because it is bewildering at the moment. But very little has been done to make it easier, and if anything, it's probably going to be harder, because you're going to be bouncing backwards and forwards between your service provider and the assessors, the independent assessors, more often. So that adds another bit of complexity to the system. But there are, so you've got to go through I won't even remember them all, the things you might end up having to do. You'll call the My Aged Care number, you might look at its website, you might have spoken to somebody, support older people in Centrelink office. You'll be sent to a independent assessor. You'll be then trying to find a provider. You might then have to have somebody else assess you if you need aids and appliances or something like that. And of course, there's OPAN, who can advise and support.
And there's your children that will tell you what you need.
Or what you will be doing. Yes. And so, for example, just to pull one example out, is why at first contact you can't be speaking directly with somebody from the assessment organisation. I don't know. Why is that? Why are there two separate functions? It was set up that way. So My Aged Care was meant to be one thing, but it never delivered on it. It was meant to be something that was very helpful to people. Now we have to have separate aged care navigators as another category to help people get their way through the system, because the thing that was meant to do it hasn't done it. And I know that the aged care navigators are focusing on the most vulnerable in the community. But if you actually listen to what they do, almost a very large percentage of older people could actually benefit by that support. But that was what My Aged Care was meant to do. In terms of getting into the system, it remains just as complex as it was. And you've got to hope that the new independent assessment tool that's been designed will accurately assess people for their needs, because once it's been you've got your plan, which comes out of the independent assessment process. If you need something different, you're going to have to go back on the waiting list again to be reassessed. And there's something quite fundamentally problematic about assessing people in a short discussion or interview and trying to identify needs that are volatile and changing over time, and with people who are probably pretty nervous in many cases about what's all this about and who are you and where are you from, to try and get that done accurately. I think the whole model of assessment is trying to do it on the cheap. And we also know at the moment, because they've got so many that they've got backlogged, a lot of them are being done over the phone, and they really cannot be done properly over the phone. Now, I understand there's pressure on the assessors not to do that, but if you're looking at 5,000 assessments that are outstanding that you're meant to have done, I guess that
regional workforce shortages and things like that, right?
That's right. So you've got to wait until the assessor comes to town every 6 months or whatever it is.
But so much of that is like there is pride, right? We all have pride and we don't actually want to admit where we perhaps might need some support. And how does an assessor appropriately do that quickly, even if it is a face-to-face,
But, so my business, Allied Health Provider, we wanted to be part of doing the assessments.
Right.
I'm not big enough to be a direct registered provider with the government. So your option is to, can you be a subcontractor to one of the head contractors? We made some inquiries. No one was interested. But then you hear the figure that, hey, I've got a workforce, covers quite a large area between Sydney and Brisbane with availability to provide assessments. We've made inquiries. We can't get any.
Yeah, we're screaming out.
That's right. And you hear things like that and it's frustrating, right? Because I have a workforce, physios, OTs, exercise physiologists can do the clinical component of it, but we can't get some crumbs off the table to do a few of them.
Yeah, so they had a re-tendering process at the end of last year. I won't say too much about it, but other than they ended up appointing some new organisations who'd never done it before and who didn't have access to expertise that they needed. And it's taken a very long time for them to try and get that workforce in place. And from what I understand, some are either only just getting it in place now or haven't quite got there yet, and knowing that there is your organisation and many others.
Of course,
If you came up, this is actually one of the examples where what they've created is a much more complex system. Rather than making it easy for people to get the aged care they need, it would be good if there were many pathways into aged care, support at home, not just this single, send them all through My Aged Care, a rigid government-controlled system, rather than a much more flexible, possibly local set of arrangements where the resources of the communities could be brought to bear. And the government could put some gatekeeping in to make sure that people were not getting access to things that they really shouldn't get access to. That could be done far more simply than it's being done, in my view anyway.
You mentioned you wanted to talk about what we need to watch after November 1. If you had to pick a few indicators of the success of support at home, what would they be?
I would be wanting to know about how many people are rejecting assistance they really need.
Based on cost.
Or whatever. Yeah, but cost would probably be the key reason. And what the flow and implications of that are, not just a head count. But what has that meant? Has that meant people have ended up in hospital, which is what people presume will happen? Well, will it happen? We can't really know until we get there.
And that would carry with it quite a high dollar value cost to the government too.
Massive. And yes, and I think also the state governments are making a lot of noise at the moment about older people who are in hospital who clinically do not need to be there. It's not good for the older people, not good for their health, their mental health, or their physical health to be stuck in a hospital bed when you don't need to be. What about the members of the community who really need access to that bed? So I'd want to watch that. I'd want to go back to the end of life, palliative care. What is actually happening for people who are living longer than the 4 months which can be funded? How's that playing out? How much stress is it really creating for the families? Has the department come up with a workaround that means it doesn't cause the concern that I think it might? I'd be wanting to watch particularly the wait list for assessment and review. What happens to that wait list? Are people waiting longer? How many people are being reassessed for things that I guess I've described through the course of this discussion that I really think they shouldn't have to be assessed for at all, which is where you're just adding in another service, which is a common service. You're adding nursing to the list for somebody. How often is that happening? And then you can flow on to that. How much does that cost the community? How much does that cost the government? How many very capable OTs and physios is that taking out of the workforce that would be a whole lot better having actually delivering services? That's the other That's the other concern I've got with all the assessment we've got to do, is it is absorbing a workforce that is desperately required to do other work. I think they've built a system that is so heavy with assessment. Again, if I was redesigning it, I'd go back to a much simpler process of assessment with just clearer thresholds. And once you've passed the threshold, you get access to a wide range of things that you need. And while we're talking about assessments, there certainly is in the written material provided from the government an acknowledgement that for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it will be very difficult for them to create sufficient rapport on the first occasion they meet an assessor to be able to get an accurate picture of their needs. I think the same statement is true for the population generally. You're dealing with very intimate issues, you're dealing with very sensitive issues, you're dealing with issues that people are often very protective about. It's a lot to expect people to open up in and to be confident to share openly with a person they've only just met these intimate details. If we're going to do assessment, let's do it well. Let's put the time in that makes it worthwhile. Give the person the time that's required. Not have a situation where we have independent assessment organisations with all this pressure to rush through as many as they can get done quickly.
Yeah, I think in that space, you've got like what we've got with our unspent funds at the moment, where providers haven't been able to encourage clients to use their funds and they're saving for a rainy day. We've got this long-term relationship, and even then we can't get people to kind of access the care and support they need. So if we're also asking them to pay more for it, we're going to be cutting our nose to spite our face, perhaps.
Perhaps we will. In terms of that, some people do save up for the rainy day. That's a very common thing, and it's been important in the past, particularly if you thought you were going to need a wheelchair or a bed or something.
Or if you're a home care package too, waiting for your 4, at least you had something in the back pocket to spend on those higher needs as they came.
The other thing is probably every older person who has home care package or support at home has their own story, is their own unique person, and our attempt to push people into boxes tends to produce bad results. The more that we can deal with people as we actually find them with their unique story, their unique circumstances, as it evolves, the better the result we can get.
You've said before that supported home risks becoming another restructure built on the same foundation. What would genuine reform look like to you, and what needs to happen between now and next week for this to succeed?
Well, I don't think we can get it done in a week. We'll give it a go, I guess. But
Depends how popular this gets.
Yeah. We're going viral. Let's go.
I think what's required is a very fundamental rethinking about what is this system trying to achieve, and what is the nature and the circumstances of the people you're trying to achieve it for. So I'd be going back and saying what we're trying to do is we're trying to help people live their best lives as long as possible in their own homes or home environments, to have the support that they require to do that. It's a wide range of support potentially. I would be designing an intake process that was very simple, that involved potentially some rigorous tools to be used, but to make it very simple for the person to actually get immediate access to what is required to do that assessment and then let them enter the system. Look, flexibility would be at its core for me, and it would be, I don't have a problem with people being asked to make a financial contribution where they genuinely can. But it should never be the case that a person has to choose between a shower and a meal. That should never be a question that goes through a person's mind. But I think with pensioners, particularly pensioners who are renting, they may find themselves asking that question. And I think the other thing I'd be doing, and while we're talking money, I'd be making the hardship provisions far more straightforward and easier to access. So the current process for being assessed for hardship is actually fairly complicated. You've got to keep many months of data. They've simplified the form, I understand, from where it was 17 pages long until recently. It's a shorter form.
15 pages? Or?
Whatever it was a ridiculously long form. It was intimidating.
Yeah.
And the vulnerable people who will need access to hardship support really need a very simple system. And so rather than design a simple system potentially with some big questions like, are you paying rent in the private market? By definition, the chances are most of your pension's gone.
Mm.
They could do some research and they actually put some numbers around this and work it out so that the individual no longer has to go through detailed processes. I'd be doing that. The other thing I'd be doing is I'd be doing a lot of review, and I'd be outcome review. I'd be looking at, has it achieved this thing, whatever it is we create? Has it achieved what we've set out to achieve or not? And if not, quick feedback loops, redesign, reconsider. The other thing I think would be great is if they could have some piloting. Here's a good idea, worth trying. Let's try it somewhere. Maybe pick up on your idea of the
local assessment workforce.
Local assessment workforce. We could pilot that, and we could have a lot, because you get to unleash the innovation, which people have ideas for how to make it better, but they're not all going to work. So you don't want to necessarily wait until roll it out right across the country before you find out it doesn't. And if you've got a fabulous idea that does work well, like that one I suspect could, let's get it done, test it, review it, roll it out once we've proven it'll work.
Government and innovation are not always two things that go well together.
Shouldn't be in the one sentence, I'm sorry.
So we've had huge reforms, and we've been quite excited about the reforms to come in this space because we know we needed change. There's been a lot of promise and hope in the sector. Do you think we've hit it?
I think there are going to be a lot of things that people are going to be pleased about. I think also from the community's point of view, it's sensible having a situation where people will not be saving or not building up pots of unused funds that really should be being redirected to other older people. I think that's all positive, and I think people will welcome all of that. I think, though, there have been some elements of the way it's been designed that really, and the whole environment it sits in, that I think people are going to be very disappointed by. So I think that what the Royal Commission was arguing for, and particularly older people who appeared before the Commission, they were asking for a relationship-based system where the relationship is the thing that comes first. Some call it people-centred or person-centred, but something based on the relationship with them. What we've ended up with is something that's actually very transactional. It's all down to this short half-an-hour period, and this is what that will cost, and what are you going to do during that period of time, and locking it all down and making it quite rigid. And that's the second thing. I think people were hoping for flexibility. We've ended up with rigidity. I think we're promised and hoped for an integrated system, so everything that fit it together very neatly, where all the different components of the system work together seamlessly. We've ended up with a very siloed system, probably more siloed than it was before. I think a lot of people hoped it would be more efficient. Again, there are all the many steps that people have got to go through to get things done. That's also an element of bureaucracy. Have ended up being very cumbersome instead. Yeah, certainly going back to some things we talked about very early on in our discussion, how it all appears to an older person. And I think people were looking for something a whole lot simpler, and we've ended up with something that's far more complex. And if you looked at the paper that is built up on my desk that relates to this program, we're over 1,000 pages now of different iterations of documents, various things that explain different things that are being released at the last minute. This is not a simple system. This is horrendously complex, and it's taking an enormous amount of time to understand it. How an older person is meant to understand it and make the most of it, I really don't know. So I think that there are design features which are exactly the opposite of what we were looking for and what the older people who appeared before the Royal Commission particularly were hoping for. I think the thing I kept hearing them talk about was kindness. And I don't think the kindness flows through to this. I think we've ended up with a machine.
Yeah.
Not a person, but a machine.
Yeah, far from person-centred or consumer-directed or human rights, all of these, acronyms and words.
The human rights is a whole other issue because they've said, that's the big selling point of the Act,
the
isn't
new
it?
Act.
So
Human rights.
Human rights are at the centre of it. Well, okay, they've been promoted in terms of where they sit in the hierarchy of formal legislative documents, but we had rights before. They had to be enforced through the Quality and Safety Commission. Well, the same thing is true. People have no right to enforce the rights themselves. But the big right, the important right, is missing, the right to aged care. There's a right to equitable assessment for aged care. The interpretation that might be you are entitled to sit on the waiting list just as much as everybody else before you're assessed.
Congratulations.
But that is not what people want. And we've had the Inspector General of Aged Care very recently come out and make some very strong statements around this. The fact that if you really want a system that's going to be fit for purpose, it has to be a rights-based system where the right to aged care is part of the set of rights.
Yeah, not your right to another reassessment to see if we can get you on the wait list for that next category of care.
Yeah. So I don't think it should ever be said that that has rights at its centre without the caveat attached. But of course, we don't have the right to aged care. That would be very honest, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe too honest.
We have a closing question tradition. If you wake up tomorrow, Adrian, it's your turn to be a consumer in the supported home program. What changes do you need or hope to see? It's the final minute of our interview, so tell us what you really think.
I think I would wake up tomorrow finding I'd been assessed as eligible for a home care package before the 12th of September last year, 2024, and I would be hoping that the government reintroduces the flexibility. I think if they did that, and if I was able to get into the grandfathered category, I think that would be a good start. And in not having that, I'd hope that they will have reclassified personal care, showers, as a clinical category.
And really what you're hoping to achieve there is choice and control over your own care and life.
Yep.
I think that's something we should offer everyone.
I think we should, and I think it brings dignity, and I think it's part of people's self-image and a sense of independence. If you're making decisions for yourself based on good information, the chances are you're not only going to get a better outcome, in fact, you're also going to have a situation where the practical things you put in place will be more effective, and you'll feel the benefit of that for your dignity, for your self-worth.
Thank you for joining us, Adrian. I hope this was time well spent. Thanks for listening to this episode.
If this was time well spent for you, follow the podcast so you never miss an episode.
If you want to support us, leave a review and share it with someone in your network who might get value from it.
Finally, a thanks to our partners who make this possible. Painters, your design and construction partner.
And Optum Allied Health, your physiotherapy and allied health partner. You can find the links in the show notes.
Thank you for listening. We'll see you on the next episode.